American colonists moved into the Ohio River Valley to try to remove the French out of there. All right? These two right on the right here. All right, yep, that. And that. And we are going to be on this here. Okay? So there's a dispute over the Ohio River Valley. Really what the dispute is about is expansion westward. Remember, both France and Britain are expanding westward, and as their colonists bump up against each other, there are rival claims and disputes for the territory between them. Now remember, the area that is most desirable is the Ohio River Valley. That is the area that's kind of the Great Lakes region. That's the logical place where both the Americans and the French colonists are expanding westward. Alrighty? And so Washington, remember, he's just a no-name colonel at this time. He is ordered by the Virginia governor to head into the Ohio River Valley to try to remove the French so that the British colonists, the Americans, can expand into that area. Alright? He fails. Remember, a war breaks out. Let's remember that it then leads to a global conflict. Alright, so we started it because of our disputes with the French colonists over land out west. Alright? Why is it called the French and Indian War? Because the Americans are fighting against the French and most of the North American Indians as well, including the Iroquois. What are important events during the war? So it's not really significant the war itself, it's significant kind of what happens around the war as well. First off, the Albany Congress, remember, occurs during the war. That was where the British asked the colonies to get together and to try to unite and work together to protect themselves from Native American attacks. The British wanted this so that they didn't have to waste as many troops doing so, right? Because it's costly to send over redcoats to help the American colonists. And remember, Britain kind of blames the Americans partly for these conflicts with the Indians because the Americans are constantly expanding westward and oftentimes ignoring Indian boundaries and treaties. All right? While at the Albany Congress, remember, Ben Franklin tries to form an Albany Plan for Union. This would have been the much stronger alliance. He suggested they try to almost create an intercontinental Congress, almost like a political union at that time. It's rejected, not only by Britain, but also by the American colonists at the time, who were still very, very isolated and separate from one another. Alrighty? What's going on? No. Alrighty, sorry. Ultimately it is rejected. But if you remember, the Albany Plan for Union was the snake, right? The divided snake, right? Essentially join or die, right? Remember? He's trying to convince his fellow colonists, hey, we should form a much larger union. Why is it significant? Because it's one of the first real attempts at colonial unity. Why is it also significant? Because it's considered to be the foundation for what the colonists are going to do about 10 years later with Britain. All right? So in many ways, Franklin's idea is a little too early for the colonists. They're not ready to unite at that point against the British. But in about 10 years after the French and Indian War, they are. All right? Please remember, the Brits ally with the Iroquois. Remember, the Iroquois are the close allies of the British and had been for some time. Please remember, this time it's the Americans, it's the Indian Iroquois, and it's the British against the French. And there are many Indian allies, but most famously the Algonquin and the Huron. Alrighty? Those are the two largest tribes or confederations, and so those are considered the two most important. Remember, how does the war end? Well, it ends with, at least in North America, when the British invade Canada. And at the Battle of Quebec, they seize Quebec. They later on seize the capital, Montreal, as well. When that happens, the fighting dies down, if you recall. And the French are forced to surrender. All right, that treaty is the Treaty of Paris. The first Treaty of Paris of 1763. All right. I will tell you one thing, if they ever ask a question on the exam involving the Treaty of Paris, or they provide you with an answer that is the Treaty of Paris, they'll always put the date in parentheses next to it. So hopefully, if you can recognize one of the years of the Treaties of Paris, you'll be able to recognize the other ones as well. All right? These first two are easy. They're 20 years apart, 1763 and 1783. All righty? Anyways, the Treaty of Paris, what happens? France is completely kicked out of North America. They lose virtually all of their North American possessions. Britain is really the only one that's really left with any sizable territory. They control the eastern half of the continent, minus Florida. It is also considered to be the end of salutary neglect. Remember, that was the policy where the British did not enforce their navigation laws. After the war, they will start doing so. One, because they realize the Americans are becoming less controllable, more rebellious. And secondly, because they're in debt after the war, right? And so they need American trade to help them pay off their debt, so they want to try to force Americans to trade only with them. Okay? What's the significance of the French and Indian War? Well, like I mentioned, it permanently alters the balance of power. From this point forward, the British are the sole power in North America. The French are virtually gone. The Spanish are on the decline. All right, so really a turning point in what we call geopolitics. The politics of that continent and who is in charge. It also leads to further conflict between the Americans and Indians, right? Because the Indians no longer have the French there to kind of help protect them, all right? It's also going to expose rifts or problems between the parent country, Britain, and the colonies, the kids, all righty, for lack of a better term. What's that?
Teenager.
The teenager. Yeah, this is most definitely, if we equate the United States to a human being throughout their life, this would most definitely, the revolution, I think, be kind of the teenage angst, feeling out your oats a little bit era. All right, folks, and then we get obviously at the end of the French and Indian War, we segue right into the start of the American Revolution, right? Because remember, there's a big road to the revolution. It doesn't just start right after the war, the French and Indian War. We build up to it, right, with a series of events that expose these problems between. Where the hell is my donut, by the way? I thought somebody was bringing me a donut. Yeah, Claudia, coming through. Oh, that was you? Oh, okay. Oh, I gotta put your name in my phone. All right, I thought you were somebody else. What did you get me? Oh, okay, good choice. All right, excellent. Thank you. All right.
Where's my donut?
Oh, I believe that was your last quiz score. All righty, all right. Anyways, folks, let's get to the causes of the American Revolution. Now, isn't it sweet how they put our little memory devices right back into the study guide? Because I know you all love the memory devices so much, all right? Anyways, I'm going to skip over the memory devices, but my point being here is you really need to know those events because each of them is a significant step in the build-up to the American Revolution, all right? Now, you don't need to know Pretty Silly Tammy, right, but you obviously need to know the Proclamation, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts as well. All right, so like I mentioned, the end of the French and Indian War leads to the end of salutary neglect, right? Salutary is kind of like friendly, and we know what neglect means. So again, it's where the British are not enforcing their laws by choice, because they believe if they just allow the Americans to trade, more money, more wealth is going to flow to Britain anyways, without regulation. By the way, the government in charge at the time in Britain, obviously, as you can probably tell, is very conservative, right? Because those are kind of conservative philosophies or beliefs. What's up? It's over there, okay? Yeah. Anyways, this really occurs at the same time that the British issue the Proclamation of 1763. Remember, the British banned the Americans from expanding west of the Appalachian Mountains, right? Because they don't want the Americans to start any more conflicts with the natives. The last thing the British want to do is have to send troops back over to the North American colonies. They've just spent incredible amounts of money to win the French and Indian War. So they ban or block the Americans from moving westward. Of course, remember, the Americans are furious by this, right? How dare you block us from these lands that we have just fought for? You need to remember the names. George III, he's the new king. He's young. He wants to challenge the Americans. He wants them to respect his authority. Of course, he has a new prime minister, a guy named George Grenville. They want to start strictly regulating the colonies. And they want to put the colonies further under control. All right? Please remember, when they established the Proclamation of 1763, Americans violate it, they break it, they continue to go westward anyways. They ignore the law, they disregard it. And remember, we have two groups that form, right, along the boundary, along the frontier, that will cross the boundary and start attacking Native Americans, right, solely to show their frustration or their disagreement with the proclamation, right? Remember, they were up in Pennsylvania. They were the Paxton Boys, remember? which kind of is easy. I think that's the only term we ever have that involves the word boys. Alrighty. And then down at the bottom, remember who it was? That other organization?
Regulators?
Regulators. Very good. The regulator movement, right? I guess they mounted up. Alright. Anyways, those are the two organizations, the two groups of Americans that challenged the line, that cross it, that inflict violence or bloodshed, just to try to rile up and anger the British, to show their frustration with them. Alrighty? At the same time that they passed the proclamation, and I should mention, I haven't mentioned it here, remember the spark that led to the proclamation was Pontiac's Rebellion, if you recall. Alrighty? Remember the Americans flood into the Ohio River Valley after the French and Indian War. Pontiac, the chief, leads a massive Indian rebellion against them. The British have to send troops back over right after the French and Indian War. After that, they issue the proclamation so they don't have to deal with any more Pontiac Rebellion-like situations. Okay? And at the same time, the Brits are going to, as you can see, really start to ramp up money-generating policies. They need money. They need the Americans to pay back some of the debt. They need Americans to start covering their own costs, especially their costs of defense. All right? The very first law ever passed is not very significant, but it's important to note that it's kind of the spark that starts all the rest. It was the Sugar Act, if you remember. Significance is it's the first money-generating tax passed against the Americans. All right? It didn't affect a lot of people. It only affected merchants. All right? But the next year is when the stuff really starts to hit the fan. All righty? That's the Stamp Act, 1765. Remember, a lot of folks consider this in some ways to be the unofficial start of the Revolution. All right? It's a tax on all paper goods, if you remember, everything from playing cards to wills, to death and birth certificates, to marriage licenses, to newspapers and pamphlets. All right? It would help pay the cost of the British keeping an army in the American colonies. Let's remember, one, the Americans don't want to pay taxes that other Brits don't have to pay. Two, the Americans don't want a standing army in North America because they think it's going to be used by the British king to control them. Alrighty? What is the response of the Americans to the Stamp Act? Well, they formed the Stamp Act Congress. 9 of the 13 colonies attend. It's the first time they ever met united, more than one colony, to resist British colonial policies against them. It's going to set a precedent for future meetings. This is the first time we ever hear no taxation without representation. How can you tax us without having representatives in Parliament to speak out on our behalf? This is also where the colonists developed the strategy of non-importation, right? If Britain's going to pass these laws against us to help their economy, we're going to refuse to import any British goods to hurt their economy. So basically the losses from non-importation are so bad that the British essentially just decide, hey, to give up on the Stamp Act. All right? Who is formed in order to enforce non-importation? Remember the Sons of Liberty, the radical organization. Their job is to make sure that people living in those cities, especially the merchants, the people at the ports, are not bringing in any British goods whatsoever. All right, and remember, they would use things like intimidation, fear, sometimes even violence, to convince other Americans not to support the British any longer. Eventually, remember, Britain rescinds the Stamp Act. All right, the economic damage of it is too extreme or too intense, and so they do rescind it, which means they get rid of it, they revoke it. Remember, at the same time, just so the Americans don't think that they can win, they passed the Declaratory Act, which says, we're revoking the Stamp Act, Americans, but in the future, we reserve the right to tax you anytime that we want to. All right? That takes us a couple of years later to the Townshend Acts. All right? This is a series of new taxes that are passed now by a new British Prime Minister, Charles Townshend. It's going to pay for the salaries of the governors in the colonies, all right, because remember the king appoints them. It's going to pay for the salary of judges that are in the colonies so that the British government doesn't have to pay those themselves. It allows, if you remember, the British to be able to search American homes and ships without a warrant if there is a suspicion the Americans are smuggling. All right? Responses to the Townshend Acts. Well, first, remember John Dickinson writes letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, which we always laugh at, remember, because he wasn't a farmer, right? He just said, "I'm a farmer," because he thought it would make him more sympathetic with the people who read his message. He claimed the Parliament didn't have the right to tax just Americans for revenue, that Americans would only pay taxes that all members of the British Empire had to pay, that they would not pay specific taxes for themselves. Alrighty? Again, we're starting to see more and more American opposition, both in written form and in terms of physical opposition to these policies. Remember, in response to the letter, Massachusetts picks up that letter and they ratify it. Their legislature does, they call for other legislatures to do the same. We're starting to see more unity here, where colonies are now rising up against the Townshend Acts. In response to that, remember, the British troops are sent to Boston, they start to be quartered in Boston soldiers' homes, all right, and Boston civilians' homes, all right. Some colonies, if you remember, go back to non-importation after the Townshend Acts because, well, it had worked so well with the Stamp Act Congress before. All right. Again, Britain sends troops to Boston in response to the Townshend Acts. All right. And those troops, of course, are the ones that are involved in the Boston Massacre, right, which is our next major triggering event, all right, that causes this rift to emerge. Boston Massacre, 1770, all right, again, British troops are now in Boston following the Townshend Acts. Resistance, thank you. Of course, what happens, right, we know with the massacre, shots are fired, we're not sure, thank you. We're not sure if it is the Americans that fire the first shot or the Americans that provoke it or what. Ultimately, British troops fire on an American mob. 11 Americans are killed. Remember, this is an important event for Americans, especially the Sons of Liberty, who then use it to rile up opposition to the British. This is a turning point. It's the first bloodshed we see between the British and their American colonists. All right? Short time after the massacre, because of the outcry, Townshend Acts are repealed. That's the second time in 5 years the Parliament has tried to pass a law and then been forced to repeal it because of the resistance. Afterwards, of course, all that remains is a small tax on tea. Fast forward to 1773, we get a new Tea Act. Remember, the Brits want the Americans to purchase only British-produced tea, right, from a group called the British East India Company. Of course, what happens is the Sons of Liberty, outraged that they're being forced to pay this specific tax, board those ships. Of course, they throw the tea overboard. It becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. How does Parliament respond? They respond by passing the Coercive Acts, right? They're going to use force against the colonists now. It's called the Coercive Acts in Britain. They're known as the Intolerable Acts in the American colonies. Alrighty? So again, this is when we start to see Americans form their committees of correspondence as well, where leaders in each of the American cities are going to start sending letters to each other. They're going to start corresponding with each other so that they can unify their resistance to the British policies. All right? Speaking of those Intolerable Acts, what did they do after the Boston Tea Party? They punished Boston and Massachusetts. Remember, they took away their Massachusetts' charter and said, you're no longer a colony. They closed Boston's port. They refused to open it until the Bostonians paid for the damages. They did not allow any more town hall meetings because they considered those to be too democratic and revolutionary. They quartered troops in American homes again. Again, remember from this point forward, if an American gets put on trial for attacking British officials or killing British officials, they're no longer going to be put on trial in North America because they were tired of North American judges and juries acquitting those people. They're going to send them to England. They're going to put them under the discretion of British judges who are more likely going to find them guilty. All right. About the same time the Intolerable Acts is passed, so is the Quebec Act. Remember, this is another one that just infuriates the Americans. It's actually a good act, I think. It's a good law, all right? It's un-British, I'll put it to you that way, all right? They essentially grant freedom of religion to Catholics, remember, with the Quebec Act. since they had a whole bunch of Catholics under their control now that they had Canada. They passed this law which said, hey, Catholics can have freedom of religion without worrying about being persecuted. That's a good thing. What they also said was that these French Canadians could expand into the Ohio River Valley. And that's what really infuriated the Americans, remember? Because they've been blocked from moving into that area by the proclamation, but now they're going to open this area up to these French colonists? That seems unfair to the Americans who had just fought with Britain against France. Okay? That takes us to the First Continental Congress, 1774. This is where almost all of the colonies attend for the first time. It is in response to the Intolerable Acts. What is their major achievement? They formed the Association, all right, which I just love that name. It's where they ban now all trade with England, not just non-importation anymore. Now it's non-importation, and we're not going to export our goods either, all right? So now we really want to try to hurt them economically now that the Intolerable Acts have been passed, all right? At the same time, well, I should say about a year later, that's when Lexington and Concord takes place. Remember, we got these British troops hanging out in Boston. They go out into the countryside looking for weapons. While they are on their way, remember, they get into a altercation, right, with American Minutemen, with American militia guys at Lexington, on the common, on the green, on the lawn, I guess you could say, of Lexington. Anybody been to Massachusetts before? Anybody been to New England? You been there?
Yeah.
You been to, like, Lexington and Concord?
Oh, no, I'm just in Massachusetts.
Been to Boston?
Yeah.
Yeah? I've never been there.
And Rhode Island.
And Rhode Island. So you're our Roger Williams. Alrighty, all right. He's the closest thing we have to a resident of the sewer. Anyways, all right. Nice, cool.
Yeah, I like
A lot of history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like those kind of small towns.
So do I. I love that. Very quaint and quintessential. Yeah, I know. Just trying to talk my lady and maybe doing a little drive up the coastline there. She was not down.
Sort of checking out Brown a little bit too, because I like that area.
Yeah. Oh, you were checking out Brown? Yeah. Great school. I know somebody that goes there actually.
Oh, you?
Yeah. Yeah, you're much better than her. I didn't say that. Alrighty, she's an Anaheim kid. I can say that. Alrighty. Anyways, Brown. Great school. Ivy League. Alrighty. Yeah. Huh? You getting letters? Yeah, you should check it out. Beautiful. No. Why? Is it just like the name? Is it color? I mean, if it were like Green University, would you be more interested or anything like that? I sometimes wonder about that, you know?
That is so racist if you don't have to it's called Brown, really.
Why do you have to put race into it? I was just saying Brown, like.
Majesty, whatever.
Alright. Alright. I mean, I don't know anybody that's green skinned, so, you know, I don't think my analogy there was really racially motivated, but anyways.
I only wonder if people don't go to it because it's called Brown. So.
It's kind of brown, I don't know. Anyways, it's not my favorite color, alright?
It's not what's favorite color, it's the color of it.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. Anyways, hey, at Lexington and Concord, remember, the first shots of the war are kind of occur, even though there's not technically been an official Declaration of Independence yet. Remember, the American forces are kind of brushed aside by the British. They continue on to Concord to find those weapons. That's when the Americans start sniping at them, start picking them off. Remember, eventually the Brits are forced to flee back into Boston, and now the situation has gotten serious, all right? That's when the Second Continental Congress forms. Shh. This is the first time that all of the colonies are present together at one time. They elect to go to war against Britain in order to protect their rights. Well, what they do is they elect to form an army, and they say, hey, from now on we will protect ourselves. All right? They name George They name George Washington as the new leader of the Continental Army. That's the army they form, the American Army. And remember, they write that really, really long title, Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. It's like a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. It's almost like their first draft. All right? They appeal to the British king and to the people of England directly. Hey, these are our complaints. listen to our complaints, fix some of these complaints. We still want to remain part of England if he'll just fix and some of these problems that we have. Alrighty. Last-ditch effort again to try to maintain peace is called the Olive Branch Petition. Remember, it was sent over to the king right before the official rebellion begins. One last time, we try to swear our loyalty to Britain and to the king. We ask the king one more time, please, 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 hear our complaints and fix some of these. Remember, he supposedly didn't even read it. Alrighty, at that point he was like, no, I'm tired of these Americans. Okay? I mean, and think about it, he's young, he's in his early 20s. It'd basically be like having Alex or somebody as the king of England. Alright? Couldn't you see Alex just waking up one day and being like, off with Majewski's head. Alrighty. Yeah, chapter guys. Anyways, Battle of Bunker Hill is the first major battle of the war. Lexington Concord are the first shots, but Bunker Hill is the first official battle. That's also the first victory for the Americans. Remember, the British keep charging up the hill over and over and over. Americans keep sending them back, right? Eventually the Americans run out of ammunition. So the British technically control the hill at the end of the battle, right? But at an incredible cost, okay? Ironically enough, at this point, we still really didn't have a Declaration of Independence or the king actively declaring that we were in rebellion. Technically, all of this is happening without an official rebellion being declared. He does declare the colonies in rebellion after Bunker Hill. Remember, this is when he starts hiring those German mercenaries, the Hessians, and bringing them over to North America. Folks, major turning point or a major piece of propaganda that convinced Americans to embrace revolution was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Remember, he's a radical revolutionary. He argues the relationship between the U.S. and Britain is already so bad, so damaged, so destroyed, there's no fixing it. Okay? That's what's going to get the Declaration of Independence. Thanks to Common Sense, many Americans in the Continental Congress embrace and finally accept that the only solution is independence. The Americans are now officially in rebellion. And, of course, they need to be if they're ever going to be able to get assistance from France or any other European country which they know they need to end the war. Folks, I'm not sure why Treaty of Paris is located there on that page, but remember, the treaty that will end the war will be the Treaty of Paris again, now 1783. And that's, of course, going to be where the Americans now will control all of the land to the Mississippi River that the British had just acquired from the French as a result of the first Treaty of Paris. All right? Not really sure you need to know these battles as in-depth as it indicates. I mean, if you can just kind of make a knee-jerk, instant reaction to some of these, then you're going to be okay. Lexington Concord, easy to remember. It's the first shots of the war. All right. Bunker Hill, first real battle of the war. All right. And afterwards, the king declares us in open rebellion. All right. Trenton, that's the famous Washington crossing the Delaware River with his foot up on the ship. Remember, that's that surprise attack that gives the Americans hope and inspiration early in the war at a time when a lot of Americans are questioning whether we can win. Remember, they do it on Christmas Day or the day after Christmas, technically. I think it was Christmas Day, actually. Yeah. Remember, he surprises those Hessians who are asleep in their cabins. Some of them, if you recall, were sleeping off some celebrations from Christmas Eve before. Alrighty, and so it's a major shot in the arm for the American cause at a time when the Americans needed it, because there's a lot of folks questioning whether we can be successful. Yeah. Yes, yes. Was that you that made that analogy yesterday as well? Somebody did in another class, yeah. Kind of talked about, hey, isn't there sort of a little bit of a similarity here with Trenton with Tet, alrighty, the Vietnamese surprise attack that was really a turning point in public opinion as well in Vietnam, alright? Whoever that was that brought that up, that is a really, really kind of nuanced and savvy kind of analogy there, alrighty? Anyways, Saratoga is another turning point battle during the war. The only reason why it's important, folks, is it's the battle that finally convinces the French to join with the Americans after the Americans win. The U.S. desperately needed French support. We knew we couldn't fight these guys forever. We were going to need to get somebody to help us. France answers the call after Yorktown, after they believe we've got a legitimate chance to win. And then, of course, the battle that ended the war is the Battle of Yorktown. That's where the last British army surrenders. It's in Virginia. Remember, it was because of the American and the French teaming up. They trapped the last British army, and they forced Lord Cornwallis to surrender
They have
to
a picture
Washington.
where George Washington gets on his horse and shakes the guy's
That's
hand.
correct. Yes, yes. And really what's happening there is, if you recall, the tradition when you surrendered is the commanding officer of the one army essentially gave his sword to the commander of the other. Washington essentially said, hey, I'm not interested in any of this, alrighty? I'm not interested in these formalities or anything like that. It was supposed to be maybe a sign that Washington was trying to already mend fences between the two sides and embrace the fact that they had some common tradition or history. Alright, anyways, hey, why did the U.S. win the American Revolution? Well, there's a number of reasons, alright? One, the Declaration is key because it helps to bring France into the war and to get us money from other European countries. Remember, we gain allies with France, and later on Spain jumps in, if you remember, at the last minute. The Netherlands does as well. So we technically end up getting most of the support from Europe by the end of the war. We got vast amounts of money from the French, and so they help us financially. They also obviously help us militarily, especially with their navy. We are really able to take advantage of distrust between Britain and France. We had been up to that point. We were able to take advantage of the fact that the French didn't really want the British to become any more powerful. They didn't support us because they supported democracy, the French. They supported us because they wanted to see the Brits weakened. Okay? Politically, the British government was inept. I know that's kind of a hasty generalization there, but they are. The king is not very strong. He's irrational. He's impulsive. A series of terrible war ministers and prime ministers during this time. In fact, if you remember from the notes, there were actually incidents when word of American victories got out in Parliament. There were actually members of Parliament that cheered American victories, alrighty, publicly, because one party wanted to see the other party in England weakened, and so they felt that ultimately, if the Americans won, that would actually give their political party more opportunity in Parliament. Shows the dysfunction that was going on in Britain. All right. American leaders were much better in gaining the support of neutral colonists than the Loyalists and the British were. Radical patriots use propaganda very well, and they're able to really take advantage of the atrocities they say that the Brits inflict upon them. Again, kind of a parallel with Vietnam, right? In terms of winning the hearts and minds of the public. We are going to see military reasons as well. The United States was too large of a territory to conquer and occupy. The Brits couldn't do that with the army that they had. They could take large American cities, remember, but it really didn't have any impact on the countryside. They had to leave the comfort of the cities on the Atlantic coast to move into the countryside to try to find the Americans. They were unable to do so. They lost support the further they went away from the cities. Again, exactly the same with the Americans in Vietnam, all right? We controlled the major cities. The further we got into the jungle, into the countryside, the less control and support we had, all righty? The British failed to take New England. Remember, they had to move first to New York, later on to the south, to try to find loyalists that would help fight with them. They struggled to maintain control over any of the regions. They didn't have a strong enough force, a large enough force to control all of them at the same time. They didn't really get as much support from the natives as they thought they would, or that support really wasn't as effective either. General Washington won critical victories at important times, all right? He's not the greatest battlefield general in the world, all right? He's a motivator, all right? Yeah. I hate to make that analogy, all right? I don't consider Carpenter to be the greatest principal when it comes to attention to detail. He's good at delegating authority, all right? You do this, you do this, you do that. His greatest thing is that I think he's kind of tries to be inspiring and fire you up. I mean, he might not fire you up because you're all, cold and dead teenagers, alrighty? But I mean, that's what his whole, sun is always shining and all these things that he always tries to tell us, alrighty? I actually enjoy him, alright? I enjoy Dr. Carpenter. You're not a fan?
No.
I do, I like him, alrighty? I do like him. I enjoy working underneath him, alright? So, anyways, although I think he's a little disrespectful to the kids sometimes, alright? He came into my room yesterday, I was talking in geography. We were looking at a project that's going on in Anaheim right now. It's called the Platinum Triangle Project. My kids hadn't heard of it. They're scared of it because we're going to rebuild this entire area of Anaheim. And a lot of the current places in this area are going to be leveled. Alrighty? And the property values when they rebuild these things are going to be a lot higher. So some of the folks that live here currently aren't going to be able to afford to live here anymore. But anyways, he comes into the room and I'm like, hey, the kids don't know anything about Platinum Triangle. And he's like, well, maybe if they watched the news or actually picked up a newspaper once in a while, they would. I'm like, whoa! All right, these are AP kids. How dare you? All right, anyways. So, hey, the militarily, Washington, so important at critical times. The Brits have to fight not only against the Americans, they also eventually have to fight against the French. Later the Spanish and other parts of the world. Remember, the war expands to other parts of the world as well, which means now the British don't just have the Americans to deal with, they got to fight European powers in Asia and in Africa. Also, the distance between England and the American colonies is immense. And of course, the French Navy helps to blockade the Brits and prevent and ultimately lead to the final surrender. What are the changes from the Revolution and revolutionary society in this country? There are some immediate changes after the war. All right, first off, remember the Loyalists all bail. All right, they get out of America. And their property is seized, remember, and sold off to pay off some of the war debts. All right? We start to actually, after the war, see a short-term decline in slavery. Americans are so fired up after the war that some of them want to spread this freedom, this independence, to new groups. We start to see the rise of anti-slavery societies after the Revolutionary War. In fact, by 1800, slavery is pretty much gone from the North already. It's gone from those northern states. It's not going to be permitted in northern states because of the Northwest Ordinance. And remember, as part of the Constitution, the slave trade is going to be abolished by 1808. Those are considered to be effects of the Revolution, where the revolutionary spirit that Americans were feeling translates over into other parts of their life. Anyways, we're going to start to see the emergence of free blacks as a result of these end of slavery laws. All right? Doesn't mean free blacks, remember, were treated very well. They were still discriminated against horrifically. But at least we start to see an end to slavery in some American states. All right? Ultimately, slavery obviously remains strong in the South, even if it starts to slowly disappear in the North. All right? There's more of an emphasis on equality. Remember, after the war, Americans want to get rid of those secret societies like the Masons and like the Cincinnati Society that Washington was a member of. They think these private secret societies are un-American, undemocratic, and might have people be more loyal to them than they would to the Constitution or to the new government. All right? Anyways, even though there is a move towards more individual liberty and freedom and equality, most people do not experience absolute equality. Women, people of color, right? People without land, right, which generally meant poorer Americans, all have less equality. For instance, they are denied voting rights. So even though we're seeing a more equality-based society, there are still plenty of groups that are not experiencing those gains. All right. We also, as a result of the revolution, got rid of primogeniture, remember? That was that idea that the firstborn son got all of the property in the family. That seemed undemocratic to Americans. So we get rid of that old British law or custom. After the war, we also start to begin to separate church and state. All right? It's Jefferson, really, who's considered the spark for this. We begin to separate our political decisions from our religious decisions. The idea is religion shouldn't be influencing the policies that your government has. All right? What else? We start to see the formation of state governments. The original state constitutions, remember, advocated republicanism, right? Representative government, which we're going to see with our constitution. They represented sovereignty, which meant the people in that state had the power to make decisions, states' rights. They had weak governors. Why? Because they had just fought against a strong king. So they did not want a strong king-like figure appearing in the colonies. So they made their governors, the people in charge, very, very weak. They gave them very limited power. Instead, they gave the legislature the power. They were the ones that made the laws. They were the important ones, the significant ones. Why? Because the legislature answered to the people, right? And in the minds of these Americans after the war, power should rest with the people. It should rest with the legislature, all right? Remember, each state had its own judicial branch, or it had its own court system, which leads to a lot of confusion after the war as to whose court's decisions outruled or outweighed others. All right? Indians get jacked as a result of the revolution because they no longer have the protection of the British. Now they're at the mercy of the Americans, and boy, we know the Americans view those Indians as merely an obstacle to their success. All right? Women did not enjoy very many increased rights during this time. They did not achieve the equality despite Abigail Adams and others' demands of their husbands. Remember, femme covert is still the law of the land. Women couldn't own property in marriage. When they married the hubby got everything, right? That became his. They couldn't sue in court because they didn't have the legal standing to do so. So they're very much second-class citizens. In fact, after the war, remember, the notion of Republican motherhood emerges. That's the idea that women are morally superior. Women belong in the home, teaching the young people morals, morality, republicanism, and the man should be outside working. The woman's place is in the home, preparing the next generation to be good, strong, democratic, loving patriots. All right? No suffrage for women, obviously. Shoot, that's not going to be for a while. And obviously unable to hold public office, which means run for government. Folks, guess what? This takes us to the Articles of Confederation, that lovely government that was Disasterville, USA. All right? The Articles. We know why the Articles were passed. Because they didn't want to give the federal government, the central government, too much power. They had just fought against a government that they thought had too much central power. So now they're not going to turn around and do the same.
Federalist Rebellion, isn't it?
Because remember, that comes after the Constitution. Alrighty, so that'll be on the next page. Okay, you're thinking of Shane's Rebellion. Alrighty. Domestic challenges. Remember, some of the military actually thought about overthrowing the government and creating a military dictatorship. It was called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Fortunately, Washington talked them out of it. Alright. The government, remember, was run out of Philadelphia. It had to be relocated multiple times. Literally, the people in government are chased out of cities sometimes by angry mobs. Alright. There's a depression in the 1780s. Our economy goes into the tank. Why? Because, well, we have all these debts after the war. We're struggling to pay them off. We've got battles between states over trade, if you remember, because the Articles doesn't say anything about interstate commerce. Individual states are going to pass, for instance, taxes against one another. Remember, we want to try to fix these economic problems. We formed something called the Annapolis Convention. Not enough states showed up, so they postponed it and set a date to fix these problems in Philadelphia a short time later. All right. Also, we've got tensions between states and even tensions with foreign governments as well. All right. Remember, at one point, we nearly gave up the Mississippi River to Spain just so Spain would stop harassing us and stop closing off access to places like New Orleans along the Mississippi River. Fortunately, we didn't sign that treaty. How disastrous would that have been? Some states actually fought with one another over land, over territory. Of course, Shays' Rebellion. You've got these people led by Daniel Shays, the famous the Revolutionary War soldier, rises up. Why? Taxes, right? Their property's being taken. They feel that the taxes are too high. They're not being paid their bonuses and their pensions from the Revolutionary War. Remember, this rebellion rages across the countryside for months. The government literally doesn't have the funds or the authority to raise an army to defeat it. Eventually, some private businessmen raised their own army and put the rebellion down. All right? They showed to many people how weak the Articles government was. It can't even respond to a little rebellion in its own country. All right. Remember, it's difficult to pass laws under the Articles. You had to have 2/3 majority, and these states rarely agreed at that level on anything. It's also impossible to amend because you had to have unanimous support, and oftentimes some states didn't even send representatives to the meetings. Alrighty. Foreign challenges. Remember, everybody picks on us too. We're the weak-kneed kid. Alrighty. Britain, obviously furious with us, right? They freeze us out of trade in the West Indies. They won't let us trade with any of their ports in the West Indies, which damages the U.S. economy at a time that we need every dollar we can get. Remember, the Brits refused to leave the forts on the western frontier. That was a promise they had made as part of the treaty. Remember, they continue to encourage Indians to attack American settlements along the western frontier to slow down American expansion. Big one as well, they start to impress American sailors. Remember, they start to board American ships, take those American sailors, and force them to serve in the British Army, which again is really a violation of those soldiers' personal and constitutional rights. All right. Spain, remember, closes off the Mississippi River to the Americans. Why? Because remember, Spain believed that some of the Southwest, some of the area around the Mississippi River belonged to them. Since we refused to give that to them, they closed off the river access to us, which we needed in order to get our crops out for sale from those western frontier areas. All right. France, remember, is pissed that we're not paying them back their money from the war. They cut off trade with us in their ports in the West Indies, which I think we all talked about. How dumb is that, right? If you want your money, France, probably the last thing you should do is to refuse to trade with us. This is one of the few ways we could make money and pay you back. All right? And let's not forget about the little guys, the Barbary States, right? Even we're so little, right? We're like the little minnow in the lake. That even the small guppies are picking on us as well. All right? Even the Barbary States, remember those pirates in North Africa? Our ships go into the Mediterranean to try to trade with European countries. These guys would send their navies up, seize our ships, hold our crews, hold them for ransom, seize those cargoes, right? Of course, the Americans can do very little to stop it since they no longer have the protection of the British Navy. We just talked about all the problems with the Articles, and my goodness, there are a lot of them, all right? Please remember, there were a couple of what are considered successes under the Articles, all right? It did do a couple of things, all right? So it wasn't all doom and gloom, although it was like 99% doom and gloom. Land Ordinance 1785 established the organized settlement of the Northwest Territory. It basically helped to determine or to set up a more orderly way that we settle. We're going to set up more linear, clearly organized and arranged colonies and settlements from this point forward, moving west. That's why many of our Midwestern and Western states have the more geometric shapes and patterns. Alrighty? And then Northwest Ordinance 1787. We banned slavery north of the Ohio River, but the real reason why it was passed, if you remember, was it set the rules for how a colony became a state. Alright? So again, there was some positive with the Articles, even if the positivity was kind of few and far between. Hey folks, this is the whole difference between the Articles and the Constitution, the weaknesses of the Articles on the left-hand side, and how the Constitution attempted to fix them to give the central government more authority, more power. All right? Again, it's pretty straightforward and simple. We're going to form a more strong union instead of just a friendship, which was what the Articles was known as. All right? Remember, we're going to give one vote. We're going to give 2 votes in the Senate to each state based on equal representation. And we are going to be choosing representation in the House based on population. Remember now, to pass a law, all it's going to take is majority instead of 2/3. Remember, who's going to enforce the laws now? A president, right, which didn't exist before. And of course, now Congress has the ability to regulate trade, right, interstate commerce between colonies or states, and they have the power to levy taxes. All right? Finally, remember, we make it easier to amend the Constitution, right? Instead of unanimous, it's going to be 2/3. The federal government can force individuals and states from this point forward to follow federal law. All right? Now the big question is, if you remember, how is this thing going to get passed, right? Because remember, there's a lot of disagreement over how the whole Constitution is going to work and whether it's ever going to even be passed, all right? Remember, if you supported the Constitution, you were a Federalist. If you opposed it, you're an Anti-Federalist, all right? Who made up the Federalists? Well, the generally more educated people, the people that owned wealth and property who were fearful they would lose it if this government wasn't strengthened, all right? They generally lived along the coastline. They generally benefited more from things like manufacturing, shipping, and trade, all right? Who opposed the Constitution? Well, remember, states' writers did because they thought it gave the federal government too much authority and power. At the same time, a lot of poor Americans did, if you remember. A lot of poor farmers, people that were in debt, opposed the Constitution. They were worried that the Constitution and the new power the central government had would be used to imprison them or take away what wealth they had because they were so poor or in debt. All right? Ultimately, if you supported the Constitution, you said, hey, the Articles are too weak, they're too ineffective. If you opposed the Constitution, you said, no, the Articles are fine, let's just try to improve them. All right? If you supported the Constitution, you said you needed to have a strong national government that had the power to respond to any threat internally or outside of the country. If you were an Anti-Federalist, you generally opposed a strong army because you were worried that it would be used right against you at some point in the future. All right? If you supported the Constitution, you thought that the government needed to be able to control states, that the government needed to be superior to the states. If you were an Anti-Federalist, you thought that the state should be equal or even more powerful than the central government. If you're a supporter, you believed that the wealthy and experienced people ought to rule your country. Otherwise, it's going to lead to mobocracy, where the lower classes are just going to rise up and use fear and rebellion to get what they wanted in the future. All right? If you're an Anti-Federalist, you believe the common people need to be represented in your government. All right? If you're a Federalist, right, you believed there was no need for a Bill of Rights, and that the national government would protect the rights of the people. If you're an Anti-Fed, you argue, no, the Constitution favors the wealthy, and so it's only going to protect them more than it will protect us. Remember, if you're a Federalist, there's no need for a Bill of Rights, but if you're an Anti-Federalist, you want those individual liberties for people to be spelled out, to be written down, so that specifically the federal government was unable to break or violate them. Ultimately, generally speaking, Federalists were more sympathetic to the separation of church and state than Anti-Federalists were. Jefferson would be an exception. Alrighty. Takes us to the last thing we got to cover for this unit, and that is the 1790s. That is the Federalist Era. Alrighty. Again, a lot going on here during this particular era. Please remember, this is the era that the Federalist Party is going to form, right? So that's why it's called the Federalist Era. It's not the same thing as the people that passed the Constitution. We got to get this government going. We got to get this country moving after 10 years of kind of stagnation under the Articles, all right? So now that we have this new stronger government with this new strong Constitution, we got to create the new government based on it, right? First thing the government does, remember, they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789 that created the Supreme Court and our federal court system. Now we'll have a federal court to resolve disputes between states so that the courts do not give conflicting decisions. We had that Bill of Rights right away. That was a promise that Federalists had made to Anti-Federalists in order to get the Constitution ratified, right? So right away they add that Bill of Rights. They had to in order to get the final thing done, in order to get enough Anti-Federalist support. All right? Next major issue is Hamilton's financial plan. Remember, Alexander Hamilton, our Secretary of the Treasury, our first, says we need to rebuild our economy. He develops a plan for doing so. All of these end up, if you remember, getting passed by Washington, despite the fact that Jefferson and his supporters opposed each one of these. Remember, we add tariffs to raise money so we can pay off our debts. That's the first tariff ever. It was just for revenue. It was not for protection. All right? Remember, we repaid back all of our debts, all of our bond debts. We repaid them back. Even though that put us further into debt, we needed to do so in order to build up our credit, our reliability, so that we could borrow money in the future. Remember, the federal government assumed all of the debts of the states. They took over all of the state debts. Why? Because a lot of those states had gone into debt to help win the war. Now that the country has been victorious, it seemed right to go ahead and absorb that debt into the national debt and have everybody pay it off together. Remember, southern states objected. They only agreed to the assumption of state debts after northerners agreed to put the new capital in the south. All right. Excise taxes. Remember, another way to raise money. We're going to tax excised goods, which are non-necessary goods. Of course, the very first excise tax is on whiskey, which will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion a short time later. And then the Bank of the United States, by far the most controversial, the one that leads to the formation of the political parties. Hamilton argues we need a new bank. It's got to be able to handle and print money. It's got to be able to store our money. He says the government has the right to build it under the Constitution because of loose construction, his interpretation of the Constitution. He says that thanks to the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, that the government has the authority to build it. Jefferson argues, no, they don't. The bank is not constitutional. He is a strict constructionist, which means he believes if it's not in the Constitution, the government doesn't have the right to do it. All right? Ultimately, Washington, while sympathetic to Jefferson's arguments, sides with Hamilton because his attitude is the country needs it, our economy is in shambles, we've got to do these things, even if, yes, maybe you're right, even if there are maybe some questions about whether it's constitutional. All right? And of course, that leads to the formation of the two political parties, and there they are, our very first two political parties. Remember, when the framers founded the Constitution, they didn't think the political parties would form, right? But within 4 to 5 years, they already have. They called them factions when they were discussing the Constitution, by the way.
And Washington warned against it, right?
He does. In his farewell address, he basically said, hey, we got to nip this in the bud now before these things become so powerful they start to really control our political system. Right? Yeah. I don't know. I have a lot of faith in your generation, all right? You'll be somehow able to strong-arm and add a few more political groups into the equation, all right? I'm looking forward to President Williamson is really what I'm saying, all righty? Anyways, yeah, I don't know, I do have some faith. I do have some faith in you guys.
I'll become president.
Okay. Well, I'll send you a congratulatory letter from Canada. Anyways, all right. I hope you do, bud. You'd be a great president. All right.
Trump can do it, so can I.
Yeah, that's going to be your message. All right, that'll be your campaign slogan. All righty. If Trump can do it, so can I. All right. So, yes. All right. Right on. I was thinking more in your guts, you know he's nuts, but hey, whatever. Anyways. All right, hey, Hamilton's Federalists, what do they believe? They support government by the upper classes. Remember, these guys believe, hey, the wealthy people should rule the country, should run the country, because they're the ones that stand to lose the most if the country fails. All right, so they've got the most on the line. So why shouldn't they be the ones that run the government? Plus, they're educated, they're more experienced, they're going to make the best decisions. Remember, they distrust the common people. They call them mobocracy, right? Younger people, the common people, the masses, they're untrustworthy, they're dumb, all right? They lack education, they can't be trusted to make these important decisions. And I believe this was at the time in the school year where Alex Tapia agreed resoundingly with every one of those statements. This was actually before the election, all right? Strong central government is what they advocate. They believe the government must be stronger than the states overwhelmingly, that it must be supreme, which it is according to the Constitution. They believe in loose construction, remember. They think national debt is a good thing, right? Because the more we're in debt, the more people the government owes money to, which means those people are going to do everything they can to help the government in order to get their money back, okay? They believe the government's job is to help business, not to interfere with it, not to regulate it. They do want to support industrialization. They think we need to industrialize as quickly as possible because we're so far behind. They think that there should not be unlimited free speech, that sometimes free speech can be dangerous or hazardous. It needs to be controlled. Remember, they are more pro-British. They want us to become closer to Britain.
That's what Adams did, right, at the end?
That's correct, yes. Exactly. Federalists, generally pro-British, so yes. Jeffersonians, hey, government for the people. They don't believe the common people should rule, but they believe that wealthy, educated people should rule on their behalf, all right? They're states' writers. The government that governs best, governs least, they say. They are strict constructionists, all right? So more power to the states. They think national debt is a curse because it's a burden on future generations, especially poorer Americans, all right? Remember, they're farmers for the most part, so they support farmers. They support an agrarian nation. Remember, Jefferson says in the future he views America just being farmland pretty much from coast to coast, all right? Well, you got that one wrong, all right? They do believe in freedom of speech. They think it's the key with which to fight against government tyranny, that there should be absolute freedom of speech. It keeps your government in check, all right? And remember, they are Frenchies, or at least they are pro-French in their foreign policy. Why? Remember, because they say France helped us during our revolution, and France is experiencing a democratic revolution at the same time, and we as a democratic society ought to support them, all right? Working our way to 1800, all right? President Washington and President Adams's presidency, major events or highlights, Whiskey Rebellion, all right? Remember, excise tax infuriates those whiskey distillers out west. What do those guys do? They rise up, they stop paying their taxes. Washington and Hamilton, remember, dispatch an army out there to put this rebellion down. As soon as the army shows up, remember, the whiskey rebels just bail, they leave, all right? It's a sign that the new Constitution has given the government the authority and the power it needs to control the states and individuals, unlike the articles before it, all right? So the Whiskey Rebellion is good for the United States government. Shays' Rebellion was terrible for the United States government's reputation, all right? Westward expansion, hey, it wouldn't be American history if we didn't talk about some natives being wiped out, all right? We also want to expand out towards the Mississippi River area, since that land is technically ours. Dang it, problem. We got these freaking Native Americans that are already there, all right? So, if you remember, the Shawnee Confederation, all right, rises up against the United States government. President Washington has to send an army into the area. They win a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. They force the Indians to sign the Treaty of Greenville, where the Indians get rid or give up of most of that Ohio River Valley land.
Treaties don't even matter.
They matter when we want them to matter. Alrighty, you're right though, right? I don't know if the treaties that were signed really had a lot of significance, since clearly they get violated often. Alrighty. Anyways, Britain does start to abandon some of its forts in the old Northwest Territory at this time as well. Anyways, Washington's legacy, or Hamilton's financial plan. Remember, Washington sets the tradition of 2 terms as president. He steps down after the second. He creates his cabinet on his own. That becomes a tradition afterwards. The whole Chief Justice thing, remember, where when we remove a Chief Justice, or he dies or he resigns, we replace him with a new one, right? Somebody that comes completely off the bench, not from somebody that's already on the court. We expand westward. Remember his famous farewell address, right? Where he warns we have to maintain neutrality, we have to avoid conflicts and alliances in Europe, and we have to avoid political parties. All of those set the precedent for isolationism in this particular country. I promise, this is it. Alrighty? Page 49, Foreign Policy. Hey, the big issue during the 1790s, after our government is finally established, is the French Revolution. Remember, that French Revolution is raging. It leads to a series of wars between Britain and France.
The X, Y, and Z.
That's coming. You got it. Yep. And originally, remember, Hamilton says we got to support the British. Jefferson says we should support the French. Washington says, hey, guess what? We're going to support neither. All right, with the neutrality proclamation. we're too weak, we're too fragile as a nation to join either side and get ourselves involved in another war, he says. We're going to maintain our neutrality. Remember, the French are infuriated by this. After all, they helped us during our rebellion, our revolution. Now we refuse to do so, even though we had an alliance with them, the Franco-American Alliance. All right? A short time later, we signed Jay's Treaty. This is the other reason why the parties formed, the bank and this. Remember, why was it signed? Because Washington said we need to avoid war with Britain. Britain is picking on us. They're angry. We didn't side with them in this fight against France. So we send John Jay over there. Remember, we signed the deal. It's not a really great treaty for us, but it does help us to avoid war. But we have to pay back debts from before the revolution in order to get the treaty signed. Jay comes back. Remember, he's unable to get the British to stop impressing American sailors. He's unable to get the British to abandon all of their forts out west. Ultimately, it gets signed and ratified anyways because Washington and Jay say we need it in order to avoid war. All right? Jeffersonians are so angry by this treaty and the Bank of the United States that that's what officially leads to the development of those two parties. All right, Pinckney's Treaty. This is a better treaty than Jay's. All right, this is where we actually gain the rights from Spain to New Orleans and the Mississippi River. Spain drops their claims to our western territories.
Was that because they thought that we were with Britain?
Correct. Yes. Remember, good memory. Yes. Remember when we went over to when we sent John Jay over to Britain, Spain totally misinterpreted that and assumed we might sign an alliance with Britain. So in order to prevent that and to improve our relations with them first, they agreed to Pinckney's Treaty, and then ultimately, right, Jay's Treaty was anything but an alliance between us and the British. All right. Hey, Washington's farewell address is very famous. It's a precedent setter. He sets his precedent for others who follow after him. Wise, all right. Encourage Americans again, permanently neutral, avoid foreign entanglements, foreign alliances. Again, right, be wary of political parties as well, all right? Because political parties might do things to benefit their party over the good of the nation. All right? John Adams takes over as president, right? He defeats Jefferson in 1796. That is really the first contested election in American history. That leads to a one-term Adams presidency. It also leads to a series of problems. The first is the quasi-war with France. Remember, quasi means kind of, sort of, semi. It's an unofficial war. We never actually declare. But France was pissed at us about the Jay's Treaty as well. They begin to attack U.S. merchant ships. We send over delegates to try to get them to stop. Remember, they are approached by these weird, mysterious dudes called X, Y, and Z who demand a bribe before the Americans are able to negotiate with the French king. Ultimately, we refuse to pay the bribe. We go back. We report it to the public. And of course, an undeclared naval war breaks out for about the next 2 years, where we didn't actually declare war against each other, but if we happen to see each other's ships on the open ocean, we tended to attack each other. All right? During the quasi-war is when the Alien and Sedition Acts are passed, because remember, Adams is getting mercilessly ripped apart by the Jeffersonians, especially newspaper editors, and he's tired of it. And so they try to silence any criticism of the war, any criticism of the government. Remember, this was even, you could be jailed if you criticize the flag. Alrighty? They also passed the Alien Acts, right? Sedition is when you talk badly about your government. The Alien Acts, remember, made it longer before you could be a citizen, because Federalists were also worried that Jeffersonians were getting an advantage over them in terms of the number of people or the number of supporters. Okay? In response to Alien and Sedition, remember Jefferson Madison write the famous Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, where they argued the states had the right to nullify these federal laws if the Supreme Court would not do so. All right? Last major incident of 1800 is the Convention of 1800. That is what ultimately ends the quasi-war. We finally signed a peace deal with France. We're going to stop the quasi-war. We officially finally get out of our alliance with them. We will not have to come to their aid or defense ever again in the future. All right? Comments, thoughts? That's a lot of material right there. I told you, 46 years, right? And a lot of things happened in those 46 years. All right? Kind of incredible if you ask Mr. Rep. All right, let's take a short 5-minute break. We'll come back. We'll do a Kahoot. All right, let's go through these. Not an excellent segue right there, but yeah. All right, so. Okay, number one direct long-term cause of the French and Indian War was D as in dog. All right, French and British disputes over territorial boundaries. All right. Number two, which of the following was a significant effect of the French and Indian War? The effect was C, the prohibition of colonial expansion into the interior. That's a fancy way of saying the Proclamation of 1763. Right? 3. The change in settlement patterns had which of the following consequences in the 1760s? They're talking about the change in patterns between the two maps. It led to B, renewed efforts by Parliament to generate revenue for colonial military expansion.
What does that mean? Parliament?
Parliament is the British legislature. They're our version of Congress. All right.
Oh.
It's also a group of vowels.
What's up? Yeah, it's also a group of vowels. Yeah, that's true. Right? No, yeah, a group of vowels is known as the Parliament of Vowels. Like a group of crows is known as a murder of crows. Yeah.
And then a group of people, infestation.
Number 4.
Holy shit.
Number 4. Concerns expressed by the author were a direct reaction to the. He's describing the B Intolerable Acts, right? One of the Intolerable Acts, remember, was they closed the port of Boston until Bostoners paid it back.
It totally gave it away when you said that.
Oh, did it? Okay.
Yeah.
Number 5. The excerpt best reflects. No, the excerpt best reflects which of the following trends from 1774 to 1776. D. The stationing of British troops in colonial residences. All right. Again, part of the Intolerable Acts, right? Number 5 is the Kentucky. Number 6 is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So 6 right away, right? Even if you didn't even read that, you should know just by the name of it. Number 6 is B, the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, because Kentucky and Virginia were a reaction or a response to it. He rarely does, which infuriates me. 7. The ideas expressed in the excerpt were most directly challenged by B. Federal laws, which unilaterally trump state statutes. Hey, what these guys are saying is, as I mentioned, hey, if the federal government passes a law, Congress passes a law, and the courts refuse to overturn it, then states should be able to nullify and have the power to overturn federal laws. So therefore, the biggest challenge to that, the biggest people that would have disagreed, would have been the ones making the federal laws, who say, no, our laws are supreme to you. All right, number 8. The concerns expressed by Washington, and of course this is part of his farewell address, alrighty. The concerns expressed by Washington were a response to B, controversy regarding support for the French Revolutionary government. He's saying we need to maintain that neutrality, right? Be careful with that, alrighty. Number 9, Washington's speech best reflects which of the following continuities in United States history? D, debates over the relationship between the United States and Europe. How involved should we be in European affairs, right? Number 10, this is why Stephen was asking, I'm guessing, when World War I happened. The excerpt most closely parallels which of the following eras? B, the 1920s. Incredible isolationism after World War I, right? The 1920s, remember those hardcore isolationist conservative presidents? They return us to normalcy, remember, which was code for isolation, all right? Number 11, the concerns expressed by the author were a direct reaction to I actually looked this one up. But I didn't like the question, to be honest with you, and I think there could be multiple correct answers. The prescribed answer, and that's why I looked over at you when you said it, the answer that is on the answer key is A. George's dismissal of the olive branch. Hey, this also occurred because of C, British military actions at Lexington and Concord. This is part of the Continental Congress that forms after. Alrighty? So if you put A or C, then technically that is a correct response. All right.
So wasn't this mostly about like the violation of rights and stuff like that?
It is.
So
It
wouldn't
is.
that be like intolerable?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Intolerable acts?
Yeah.
This isn't 12D, 12D, right?
12 is D.
Yeah, so it's.
Alrighty,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just the timing, July 6, 1775 is well after the whole Intolerable Act issue, I guess you could say. The first Continental Congress was formed because of that.
But
The second is formed in response to Lexington and Concord, and that's where this is.
the standing army was up to that point though, which is part of the Intolerable Acts.
Just in Boston, right?
Yeah.
Just keeping an eye on
It's
it.
mostly
part of
from
it.
the Hollow Petition Act because it directly says that they tried to talk to them
To reach out.
respectfully and
Yeah,
all they've
yeah.
done is dismiss.
Yeah,
feel
that's
Yeah.
the language there. You see what I'm saying there with why probably
Timing, yeah.
C would be better than D. You're right, D is more, is an indirect cause, alright, it's not altogether wrong. It's just there's more direct links to it. 12 is D, alrighty, 12 is D, as has already been mentioned. 13, we are by this constitutional laws. Okay, the issue highlighted in this excerpt most directly led to the A Bill of Rights. Alright, 14.
Also the dates, I couldn't get.
Right, true. See, but if you can recognize that based on the dates, that is such an advantage and a feather in your cap. You know what I mean? Because the assumption obviously is most are not going to be able to connect to the two. Right? That is such a major advantage. And a lot of times you're going to be able to determine answers based on those sorts of things. Alrighty, especially on the big exam, because a lot of times the answers for the big exam are more spread out throughout history, so you can immediately eliminate one or two of them based on the time frame. Alrighty. Number 14, based on the excerpt, the author would most likely agree that D, the upper crust of American society will govern justly and wisely.
I think the key line there was like, these men of learning are all embarked on the same cause.
That last sentence there is the key, right? Absolutely right. He's trying to convince his fellow colonists, hey, we can trust the moneyed classes, the wealthier groups, to rule over us. Number 15, James Madison, controlling factions. Guys, factions, again, I think I mentioned this a few times, it's kind of another word for an interest group or a political party. Alrighty, so number 15, one significant cause of the development described in the excerpt had been whether A national bank was constitutional, since that led to the formation of the first two parties. Alright, 16, a person who agreed, 15 was A. 16, a person who agreed with Madison's view expressed in the excerpt would most likely have advocated
A. I put A or B. I put A, but my second guess is B.
Hold on, let me read the question again. Let me read that passage again. By a faction, I understand numbers. The latent causes of factions are thus shown in the nature of men, a zeal for different opinions,
Yeah,
and
in
claim
fact.
them with more, and rendering them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other.
What does it mean?
Vex and oppress, that means to take advantage of others for their own interests. Alrighty? In fact, the title of it is Controlling Factions in the New Republic. The answer we were looking for there, folks, for 16 was C. Alrighty? Madison is saying, hey, we must watch out for these factions, otherwise they will dominate our governments and operate in their own interests. Alright? This is supposed to be one of those examples of how the founders did not envision political parties, did not want political parties, and yet they formed. And please note, this man who is saying this is one of the two men who's responsible for forming the Jeffersonians, right? So he kind of is hypocritical on his own argument just a few years later. Okay? 13, the key here I think is Anglican minister, which we know the Anglican Church worked very closely with the British aristocracy and government. Even if you didn't read the article, or the excerpt, that may have helped you. 19, the concerns expressed by the author. Should I skip?
17,
Sorry, folks. 1718. 1718. Based on the, it's on the same page. How did I miss that? Based on the excerpt, Thomas Jefferson would most likely support A, honoring the alliance with France. Right? That's what he and his Jeffersonians thought we ought to do. 18. Which of the following is a really way too particular question that you wouldn't actually see on the actual exam. Which of the following was an important result of J Street? Alright?
I guess
Did anybody say C? Alrighty, yeah, C was the correct answer there. Let me just explain real quickly. As a thank you, I guess you could say, for signing Jay's Treaty, the British said we could trade with their colonies, with their ports in the Caribbean again. All right. The other answer choices didn't really make sense. All right. Now on to 19 and 20. This is from a loyalist Anglican minister. All right. So that might help you. 19. The concerns expressed by the author were a direct response to B. Colonial efforts that undermine Parliament's authority. And he's saying, hey, you got to do things legally. All right, you got to follow the law. If you disagree with something, you can't take matters into your own hands. You can't go above the law because you disagree with the legality of something that's been passed against you. And so 20, which of the following evidence would best support the author's position as stated in the excerpt?
C.
C, the tar and feathering of tax collectors. Count it up, add them up, number correct, put it at the top of your packet for me, please.